Welcome to Channels Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, from our studios here in London. Over the next half hour, we'll be looking beyond the business headlines by giving you in-depth perspectives on the stories that are affecting all of us. Coming up on today's show, we spoke to some distinguished guests during a Channels Business Global exclusive invite to the launch of My Story of Water, an arts education initiative involving Lagos State Government and the Mayor of London. Now, before that report, here is some business news from across the globe. The Indonesian President Joko Widodo has promised employment at state firms for the country's Papuan residents. This follows a rise in nationalist protests, which has left at least 6 dead. Papua and the West Papua provinces were formerly a Dutch colony, but was incorporated into Indonesia after a widely criticised UN-backed referendum in 1969. This week, Chinese Premier Li Keqiang met with a US business delegation in Beijing as the bitter trade war simmers on between China and the United States. The meeting follows comments made by US Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin, who says he's expecting a positive year ahead for the American economy despite the diplomatic standoff. Chinese officials will travel to Washington later this month. The German finance minister has said the German economy is capable of countering a financial crisis. Speaking to lawmakers in the general budget debate of the Bundestag lower houses of parliament, Olaf Scholz appeared to suggest his readiness for fiscal stimulus. Last month, Europe's largest economy contracted by 0.1% in the second quarter, and weak data since has fueled speculation that Germany could slip into recession. Irishman Phil Hogan has been appointed to lead the European Union's international trade affairs. Incoming EU chief Ursula von der Leyen said Hogan was an excellent and fair negotiator. He had previously worked for agricultural affairs in the outgoing Commission. The trade role will include determining future EU-British relations post-Brexit. Hogan has been quoted as saying that a no-deal departure would have serious consequences. Hundreds of demonstrators took to the streets of Buenos Aires this week in a planned protest against President Mauricio Macri's austerity policies. Argentinian workers are demanding economic relief as Latin America's third largest economy reels from recession and growing fears of a debt default. The country's economic growth has stalled sharply over the past year, with official data showing that inflation is far outstripping salaries. Sudan's former leader Omar al-Bashir was the only person with a key to a room at the presidential palace holding millions of euros in cash. This is according to Yasser Bashir, the toppled leader's last office manager. Millions of euros and Sudanese pounds were found at Bashir's residence in April. The charges carry maximum prison sentences of around 10 years. As Zimbabwe continued to mourn former leader Robert Mugabe, who passed away last week at the age of 95, the country's finance minister, Mthuli Ncube, has established a monetary policy committee in his latest attempt to stabilise an economy in freefall. The committee is a step towards Zimbabwe setting a benchmark interest rate and introducing inflation targeting as the country's newly introduced currency plunges and its consumer price index heads towards hyperinflation. Earlier this week, I sat down with Zimbabwean broadcaster Thamsanqua Zhou to ask how the country, once the breadbasket of Africa, fell into an economic tailspin under Robert Mugabe's tenure.
What happened in Zimbabwe is that Robert Mugabe's government was very close to the West in terms of economic trade during the Cold War times. And at that time, the West needed him. And he was, at that time, also protecting a lot of white farmers who had acquired the land under the colonial legacy times. So what you then had for the first 17 or so years was him trying to maintain that. And then after the Berlin Wall came down, we then saw what he was trying to do with the economic structural adjustment programs.
He had an economic
structural, the one that you know from the IMF. So what he was trying to do now, move away from a socialist model where a lot of people were getting work, to try and liberalize and try to shrink what you might call the workforce at that time. And that didn't work because Zimbabwe didn't have something else in the economy for people to go to. So you either in work as a means of looking after yourself. There was no opportunity at that time or an industry to create your own business. There were no entrepreneurial programs because most of what he was doing was education and education, but colonial-based education where it was about the grades. You have 5 O-levels or GCSEs, including maths, English and science, but a lot of people did not have the skills to create jobs for themselves. They were working for other people. There were political human rights abuses in the South. At the same time, people in the North were enjoying a good economy, education, healthcare, and everything like that. After 1997, when the war veterans began to demand that they wanted land, they wanted compensation for having
Pensions.
fought in the liberation struggle, then he clashed with the West because the West was not happy that all these things that they were demanding were not budgeted for. And that is when the Zimbabwe dollar then just crumbled overnight. I remember that November night in 1997. And then after 2000, when the local people started taking back the farms, that introduced a political clash with the West, and Zimbabwe was later put on sanctions. So when you now run an African country that is under sanctions, I can't think of any now beyond apartheid South Africa that then sanctions are part of what brought down the apartheid system in South Africa. Now Zimbabwe, I can't think of many African countries that have been under sanctions for almost 20 years. And
gosh, there are several, but I suppose they're tied into debt, aren't they? And elephant traps. But what does Zimbabwe look like today? What is the Zimbabwean economy? You're there regularly. You are from Zimbabwe. Is it still tough?
It is very tough for 3 reasons. The first is that the sanctions are hurting. So you will see that the new administration is trying everything it can to reach out to the United States of America to lift the sanctions, to reach out to London and Brussels to say it is time that these sanctions are lifted. It doesn't make sense for a country that was the jewel of Africa to crumble because anyone in the farming sector has nowhere to sell whatever they might produce. The financial institutions which used to support the agriculture have stopped doing that because of sanctions. Zimbabwe is rich, of course, when you talk about mining and talk about anything, but as long as you are still under sanctions, you can't trade, you can't get lines of credit.
Can Zimbabwe petition on their own? Do they not need the backing of their regional neighbours? Do they not need the backing of the African Union to prevent that and stop this?
Well, they've reached out to President El-Sisi of Egypt, who is the chair of the African Union, when he goes to the United Nations General Assembly to take that case up. But the SADC region, the Southern African Development Region, under President John Magufuli of Tanzania, have already said they set aside a day in October where they will do a solidarity march, and there will be other events to try and tell the world that it is not fair to continue to keep Zimbabwe under sanctions, especially given now that it's not quite clear why Zimbabwe is still under sanctions. There are people who say, well, do some political reforms or legal reforms on issues of security. But Zimbabwe is arguing that if they loosen the security, that could hurt the business interests of those people that will invest in Zimbabwe. They need to be able to support and protect even American citizens if they are in Zimbabwe. Because if you take away all those laws, and I think the ministers in Zimbabwe asked the United States to test the Zimbabwean laws and say, if these were your own security laws, would they be sufficient to protect your citizens? And they said no.
That's a very good question. ZANU-PF, you're talking about ministers. Some would say ZANU-PF is unsalvageable, you know, with or without Mugabe. Emerson Mnangagwa, he's 76. The median age of Zimbabwe is 20. This is not just a Zimbabwe problem. This is an issue around the continent, but we are talking about Zimbabwe today. Doesn't the 20-year-old want a technocrat? You know, the old liberators from the past are just, you know, they just don't understand how fast the new world is moving?
I think there's a difference between the politics of the nation in the national interest and the political parties. Some of these vanguard political parties that fought in the war have deeper roots with communities, especially in the rural areas, that go beyond your Twitter, your Facebook.
That's true.
So
But do the deeper roots, does that bring money? Does that bring
it brings them votes? Because
infrastructure, development?
It actually brings them votes, because what then happens is it really doesn't matter what you do on Twitter or Facebook. The relationship that a party like ZANU-PF or ZAPO or ANC or Chama Pinduzi, or what you had with Bouteflika in Algeria, these political parties will always get the votes on the ground. And that is one thing I think especially the West has struggled to understand, that why would ZANU-PF still win an election with a 2/3 majority even when the country is struggling?
The 2/3 majority is questionable.
Yeah, well, in the United Kingdom, the Prime Minister doesn't have a majority in Parliament. So what you then have is every election you'll be saying opposition parties are not contesting the parliamentary elections where there's a 2/3 majority, because they will be knowing what will have transpired on the ground. So it is that failure to balance things.
What I want to ask, Tam, is are the ZANU-PF and are the leaders, the opposition, the ministers, the structure of the opposition and government in Zimbabwe, is it out of date? Are these the people that are going to bring about economic reform that those who are allies, those who are regional partners, people in the diaspora want for Zimbabwe?
It is a difficult one to call. I'll tell you that the opposition in the main, these are new people. You're talking about a 41-year-old leading the opposition. You're also talking about a lot of the
powerless
ministers.
41-year-old.
Well, with power in the cities. Because the MDC is running the local government in cities, but failing, but they are running them. More potholes, of course, but they are running them. More corruption, of course, in the local government, but they are running them. At least they can show, they can show what they can do, whether they can run a country or not. But then even within ZANU-PF, when you look at the ministers that President Mnangagwa has, most of them are very young ministers, new, most of them lived in the diaspora. You have a finance minister who is probably one of the best finance ministers in Africa.
Wow. So that's a huge statement, Thamsanqua.
That is correct. You can look at his record. You can look at what his colleagues say.
Well, I suppose his record will be if he can take Zimbabwe out of the dark pit that she's in. Very quickly, Tam, what would you say is the legacy of Robert Mugabe? Not an unbiased legacy, but from the people of Zimbabwe and across the continent.
It's a mixed legacy. There are a lot of good things that he did for people, especially in the north. You talk about education, you talk about healthcare, you talk about providing the infrastructure for a lot of things that they need. And a lot of those people have been able to go into the diaspora when Zimbabwe started failing, when it was under sanctions. In the south, the issues are different because most of the people in the south, after the Gukurahundi, were left behind. It was always difficult to catch up. Even now, people are still angry. But when you look at his move from the West, in particular, when the land dispute came up, he then looked at Africa and the East. And you find that in a lot of African countries, he's considered as a hero because they see him someone who was able to stand up against what the West was doing at the time, which was quite unusual. And of course, he's got respect from the Chinese and others. And now you see a lot of African leaders, when there's a China-Africa conference or summit, a lot of African leaders go there. When there's maybe a Russian Africa summit, a lot of Africans go there. So you are changing. He is probably part of the reason why there was that change from the West, which was using aid to relate to Africa, and the Chinese and the Russians and the Japanese who are using trade and innovation to try and get influence and close to Africa. So Africa probably, once it becomes one market, will be able to look internally. So you will continue to have Africans saying he's a hero because of what he did. Similar to people like Thomas Sankara. It's very, very difficult to fight against the West. But internally, people will say the sanctions are hurting. He was part of the reasons why there are sanctions, because the West was targeting him. But also you have all these opportunities to try and revive that country once the sanctions are lifted.